So in this segment, we're going to be discussing the COVID inquiry, and this is really bad. This kind of exposes, I think, the heart of not just the Tory party, not just the MPs and the ministers at the time, but also Boris Johnson exposes the fraud that this country put in as Prime Minister. This is fraudulence of the highest levels. So start with this clip of Andrew Marr.
Today, we learned from the inquiry into the COVID pandemic what we already knew. We learned that at this frightening and dangerous time in our history, we had a government which was feckless, slipshod, incoherent, and in general, an utter ill-disciplined shambles.
That's something we could have told you before the pandemic, big man. Honestly, we could have told you that before. But, that didn't happen. Especially when, what's his name? Brandon Lewis said there'll be no border in the Irish Sea. And lo and behold, there was a border in the Irish Sea.
We learned that senior civil servants, who, by the way, do not seem to have had any grip on the situation themselves, believed they had, quote, a weak and indecisive Prime Minister.
But, blaming the civil servants doesn't really make sense when it's not their job to lead. They're there to listen to ministers and try and implement what the ministers want. If the ministers are completely confused and bamboozled, how do you think civil servants are going to react? Doesn't make any sense, does it?
We learned that the country's senior civil servant, Simon Case, who is off sick and not giving evidence himself,
Shock.
thought that Boris Johnson's proposed approach would be, quotes, Trump-level, mad and dangerous, and that he called for the government, for whom he worked in such a senior position, a tragic joke.
Boris Johnson said, can you get rid of COVID by putting a hairdryer up your nose? That has to be almost as bad as when Trump was saying, you can inject bleach and UV rays and some other stuff. Almost as bad.
In a message from the Time, Case also said of Johnson, he cannot lead and we cannot support him in leading with this approach. Government isn't actually that hard, but this guy is really making it impossible. But you might say, what is the point of an expensive, big public inquiry to tell us what, broadly speaking, we already knew about Number 10 at the time? We knew it from television dramas. We knew it from the newspapers. We know it from books. But I think this is wrong. I think it is important that calmly and in public, in a forensic legal atmosphere, the people who were at the heart of government at the time are asked direct questions and obliged to give direct answers, even if all too often they have conveniently poor memories about exactly what happened. Tomorrow it's Dominic Cummings. Today it was Martin Reynolds, Boris Johnson's private secretary, and known for obvious reasons, I'm afraid, as Party Marty.
Party Marty. He must be one of them. Was he the bring your own booze guy?
About his emails encouraging those notorious lockdown parties, let us be fair, he apologised properly and personally 3 times. He was deeply sorry, he said, for the emails and apologised unreservedly to the families of the...
Yeah, and, is he apologising because he got caught, though, really? Probably. I wonder how sincere he was. But, the whole point of this inquiry, yes, it's expensive, but it's to get this stuff on record, I think, especially for kind of people in the future, especially for people now to realise, yes, the politicians you elect are important because you don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, a once-in-a-lifetime once-in-a-century pandemic is obviously once in a century, but generally you don't want to elect a bunch of dodos in case things go wrong. Look at the situation in the Middle East now. Imagine Trump was there. Trump was the one who wanted to move the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Imagine, if he was in charge of America right now. Joe Biden has not been good, but Trump would have been worse. And so we elected a bunch of frauds. We were hit by an absolute catastrophe, and Boris Johnson had no idea how to deal with it. We were, I think, the worst in not just the G7 in dealing with the pandemic. We were the worst, I think, in the G20. And that was despite the fact that we had more notice time than other, kind of G20 members. Italy got hit first. The fact that we have worse numbers than Italy is a joke, an absolute joke. And the fact that we're an island, we have massive advantages over the countries that have land borders, but yet we still flopped. There's just lots to talk about here. Boris Johnson ruled out a second nationwide lockdown in 2020 because the median age of those dying above 82. And he said 82 is above life expectancy, despite the fact that, people are being hospitalized. Just because you survive COVID doesn't mean that you don't end up in a hospital. Doesn't mean you don't end up on a ventilator. Doesn't mean that you don't end up with long COVID. And he said hardly anyone under 60 goes into hospital, 4%. And, if you think of 4% of the under 60 population, that's way more than enough to overwhelm the NHS. I just wish that they screenshot this because it's a big ass light here. there are 3 million Macs in this country aged over 80. You know, if a lot of them ended up in hospital instead of just dying straight away, the NHS would have been overwhelmed even more. You know, the kind of callous nature of this are, you know, they're old, you know, it's their time to go. It's just a joke, you know. Imagine this was their relatives and they were speaking like this. Shambles. This is from Helen McNamara, who we'll be talking about later on. You know, she was saying apparently Boris Johnson was confident the UK would sail through the pandemic. So McNamara, the person here, she was most concerned that the public wanted to know the right things to do, but it wasn't clear. And to be fair, we had no idea what was going on, because they said it wasn't asymptomatic, it wasn't airborne, and then it was. Just the amount of kind of confusion around the whole thing was, you know, just it was an omni-shambles. You know, Boris Johnson went, you know, he said publicly, I shook hands off COVID patients. You know, he made it out to be a massive joke. And then once we realised it wasn't a joke, it was too late. You know, Boris Johnson thought old people should die, mentioned that. You know, some of the messages I'm not going to repeat on here because it's just, you know, the contempt they held the people in, the contempt that Dominic Cummings held the civil service in was you know, just it shows you the kind of the nature of the man, especially some of the language he used as well. You know, Boris Johnson thought it would be like swine flu. Swine flu not that bad to people, and it's not as contagious. Yeah, no, it wasn't like swine flu, and that's why you should take pandemics seriously. Because worst case scenario, you've overbought certain items that can be used anyways, or you know, if you've over prepared. Best case scenario, it's nothing. If you don't prepare for a pandemic, worst case scenario, you have hospitals being full and people dying, which we saw. Matt Hancock, apparently, he wanted to decide if people lived or died. This is really just bizarre. You know, dude desperately wanted to be God or something, Mr. Kissy Kissy. It was a situation where they wanted to apparently take the decision out of the hands of medical doctors and give it to the Secretary of State. Genuinely bamboozled at this. I hope he has to. I don't know if he's going to give evidence, but you know, I don't know. You know, this is Simon Stevens. I think his name is. Is that him? This is one of the medical professionals. Yeah, I think it's Stevens. Says Matt Hancock thought that if the decision had to be taken about who would live and who would die, that should be a ministerial matter. He says Hancock said, quote, Hancock, quote, took the position that in this situation he, rather than the medical profession or the public, should ultimately decide who should live and who should die, end quote. And I do wonder, what would he have decided on? You know, this guy who is desperate to play God. What would he have decided? And he said, luckily the NHS never got to a position where anyone did have to take these decisions, but of course they did have to decide who went on the ventilators and the other things that were completely, you know, that the country didn't have. And I can't imagine that was an easy decision for any healthcare professional to make, of who would get the ventilators and who wouldn't. This from Rishi Sunak, saying he didn't notice the misogyny in 10 Downing Street, which is something we'll discuss as well, because Helen McNamara had a lot to say.
I don't know if you've seen Helen McNamara's evidence. She's described a culture in Downing Street, toxic, misogynist, lying, incompetent. You were around at the time. Did you not notice any of this?
Well, I think during COVID, I was busy trying to make sure that we protected the economy and people's jobs, and working on things like furlough at the time. But
I was too busy to notice any misogyny, Governor, but I can guarantee you, in my government, there is no misogyny.
But it's right that we have an inquiry to learn the lessons from COVID, and that's why the government has fully cooperated. I haven't seen her evidence, Robert.
Of course you haven't. Classic politicians dodge. Did you see this evidence? Did you read about this? No. I haven't seen it, Governor. Not seen it, boss. Been too busy.
So I can't comment on it, but what I can tell you is the government's fully cooperating with the inquiry.
That's not even true, because there are COVID messages he should have given over, but he didn't. So this idea that the government are fully cooperating, it's like you're not even fully cooperating.
And I'll be giving evidence later as well, but it's right that we learn the lessons from what happened. But during that time,
let's not forget he was nicknamed Dr. Death.
Yeah. I think you remember, because you were seeing me at multiple press conferences. I was spending all my time on interventions to help protect people's jobs, like furlough, and as we now know, that because of those interventions, our economy recovered faster than most other European countries.
I mean, our economy fell off hard. Oh, do I have to go back through this again? Really, back down memory lane? Our economy recovered faster because it fell off the most. We had a much bigger amount to recover. You know, it's not hard, Rishi, mate. Clearly, you should have stayed in maths school until you were 18.
And that's what I was busy doing at the time, and it's a record that I'm proud of.
No, totally. But you think you have cleared out the misogyny?
My Downing Street is a place where I think people are not just happy to work, they feel fulfilled, but that's trying.
So this is a guy saying he was too busy, he was busy working and he didn't notice any misogyny, and now saying, his Downing Street is cleared out of that. How would you know when you're apparently too busy to see that kind of stuff? What? This Peston clip as well, it's the same thing. This more from McNamara, which is quite interesting. She was emailing, I think, people within the NHS saying that just thought I don't think she knew who to email, which is kind of funny, which does show you the mess that the government were in. But she was saying that the overwhelming workers in the NHS are female, nurses female, care workers female. Have they ordered PPE that would be fit for women, considering that obviously women's bodies and face shapes are different to men's, which is the point that she makes here, which again, she makes the point that the room was full of macho men who didn't understand the experiences of other people. This is something you definitely would not have taken into account. Also, the fist, that's a fist bump, not a punch, is kind of funny. Why you would include that, I don't know. But this is important because evidently the people in charge had not taken things like this into account, and given the fact that the PPE that we bought was not even fit for use, at least large amounts of it, because we decided to give money out to people for free, it would not surprise me if they did not factor in PPE for women, given that they didn't even factor in PPE that would be safe for people to use in general. So this more from her. She was saying the no-deal Brexit preparations had bent the government machine out of shape. And so that because there were civil servants allocated to dealing with no-deal Brexit, they didn't have enough to deal with COVID initially, which is another thing that, another problem we ran into. She talks about Johnson's monomaniacal focus, which means that someone who's obsessed with just one thing or one issue. And Boris Johnson just didn't care about certain things. I think COVID was one of them, given that he missed several COBRA meetings about this. COBRA being the kind of big, really important cabinet meetings that we have in this country. There's more from her. This is where she talks about the macho culture. Everything was contaminated by ego. It was positively unhelpful when the country needed thoughtful and reflective decision making. And this is a civil servant here who was probably doing her best to figure out, what can we do to try and steer the country through this, and she was dealing with a bunch of clowns and a bunch of egotists who thought they were higher than everyone else, especially if what they said about Matt Hancock is true. Doesn't surprise me. So I do feel kind of bad for the civil servants in this situation, where they are probably, a lot of them would be trying to do their best in some of the worst circumstances and being led by a bunch of clowns. This is Guso Harry kind of confirming that, saying sometimes Boris Johnson leaves two people who've advocated different courses of action with the impression that he's agreed with both of them. And that's one of the things that Boris Johnson's really good at, and that's how he keeps people on side, because he can leave people with the impression that he's listened to them and he's going to try and do what they've asked him to do, whereas he has no intention of doing it. That's something austerity boy Rory Stewart talked about. He goes, he went into a meeting with Boris Johnson, he was very frustrated about something, as far as I remember, and he came out thinking, hey, wait a minute, I've just been played. So, there's something Boris Johnson's very good at, manipulating people. More from McNamara. This actually, I'll play the clip for this one.
If you don't, it would be helpful to me to make a couple of comments about those messages. The first is I think it's important to understand what was actually...
So I think this is the one where Dominic Cummings allegedly called her a C-word. ...
happening at the time. So it is undoubtedly true that the Prime Minister had offered me any number of permanent secretary jobs in order to leave the Cabinet Office during that period of time. And I had repeatedly explained that I wasn't going to participate in another of my colleagues being moved on in order to create a job for me. And so we had been having this exchange for a period of time. The things that Mr. Cummings, having seen those messages, it was, it's horrible to read, but it is both surprising and not surprising to me, and I don't know which is worse, actually. I think that he was frustrated with me at the time. I would absolutely own that. I would also say all I was doing was actually working in the service of the then Prime Minister and defending his interests. I'm sure lots of this is not for you, but the two things in particular that he was cross about, one was the appointment of David Frost as the National Security Advisor, where the proposal was that Mr. Frost, who had left the civil service as a director, and then taken on very significant political roles, that he be then reappointed into the civil service as a permanent secretary.
Let's not forget, this guy, Lord Frost, who got this trade deal, a tremendous trade deal with the EU and the Northern Ireland Protocol, and then as soon as it was signed in, completely denied it and tried to break international agreements. Yeah, that guy is head of national security. Okay.
And put in charge of national security. And for reasons I don't probably have to go into, I thought that was wrong, so I wouldn't let that happen, and had in fact come up with a proposal that would fulfil what the Prime Minister wanted, which is that Mr Frost should join the Lords and be a minister.
So I'm not sure what the other thing that they were annoyed about her at, but, you know, evidently she caused... not she caused the issues, that she was seen as an issue because she wouldn't do what they told her to do. And, you know, they said some very problematic things towards her, which, again, doesn't surprise me given the things that, you know, Dominic Cummings has said about other people. You know, she says that she would find it hard to pick one day where regulations were actually followed inside the building, which is nuts considering, like, we know about a few of the instances of the laws being, you know, the COVID regulations being broken, but not all of them. And I do wonder how many more days or how many more events do we not know about, and I wonder if they would, if she'd be willing to kind of give evidence to that. I'd be quite interested in seeing that. This is more from her. She's saying, like, quote, there wasn't enough thinking about the overall experience of children who might not have the same privilege as the people who are in the rooms in Whitehall to making those decisions, end quote. And I believe 100% I think that's true. They didn't think of the impact of kids having to learn from home because the school lockdowns, etc., which, again, you know, these are things that when they did the school lockdowns, things they should have really thought about. I'm not saying I was against those decisions, but given the fact that they went into lockdowns later, it meant schools had to be closed longer. You know, the impact of kids who couldn't go outside because they didn't have gardens and things like that, you know, maybe they should have made parks more available. I don't know. You know, this is me playing Monday morning quarterback to an extent, but point being is that there wasn't anyone in the room to tell them, someone who was from, you know, a proper working class background, or people consulted that would understand that these are some of the issues that would arise from them, because these were people of incredible privilege that made these decisions. She says, quote, you shouldn't, as a state, as a government, to not know and understand the whole population in your decision making, particularly the people who are outside your day-to-day experience. That causes problems. If you think that your life is the same as everybody else's, it's fine to do that as an individual, but institutionally it's wrong, end quote. And I don't think that's fine to even do that as an individual, forget institutionally. But point being is, like, these people who just didn't take into account the effects that some of these decisions would have on working class people is shown here, and is shown in the statement she made about, you know, macho men and ego and all that kind of stuff. Dominic Cummings called Boris Johnson a trolley because it was known he would change direction, and this is the man who Dominic Cummings helped elect into Parliament. Into government. And further to this, you know, he was saying, like, you know, we had to get Boris Johnson in, or he doesn't regret backing Boris Johnson because the alternative would have been Jeremy Corbyn. And you can say what you want about Jeremy Corbyn, I genuinely think 100% he would have done a better job at dealing with the pandemic than these frauds ever would have done. I can honestly say that, hand on heart, that I think Jeremy Corbyn would have done a much, much better job. He probably would have listened to the actual experts on this stuff, and, you know, gone into lockdowns much earlier, and given out a lot more financial support to the people impacted by COVID, which would have lessened the impact of COVID, and we wouldn't be dealing with a lot of the kind of hangover from COVID that we are dealing with now in terms of people who have long COVID, amongst other things. And I think healthcare workers would have been treated with way more respect than us just clapping, oh yeah, you know, great job everyone. Putting them, you know, in very dangerous situations with, you know, without an ounce of respect, honestly. You know, Dominic Cummings, this man, he you know, his legacy is incredibly tainted by the decisions that they made in government. Once they gave him power, that was it. You know, the decisions he made were awful. And, you know, in the end, at the end of his kind of run, he just spent time briefing against the Prime Minister's wife, calling her Princess Nuts. You know, this is a guy who, I don't know if he sees himself as a puppet master, but, you know, he's not as good as he thinks he is. Let's be honest. He's no Alistair Campbell. And this is the last thing we want to discuss, which is the Scottish Government will hand over more than 14,000 WhatsApp messages to the UK inquiry. I don't think the Scottish Government are under any kind of investigation from the inquiry. I think they might be doing this more as a courtesy, and more to kind of show to the Scottish people what they, you know, what the Scottish kind of government have been up to. During the time of COVID, they're handing over a load of messages. I think Hamza Yusuf might have been the health minister at the time, so he's handing over a lot of stuff. The government has been criticised for not handing over all relevant data to the UK inquiry, which is something we spoke about earlier. Nicola Sturgeon refused to say whether or not she had erased any messages. I mean, I would be surprised if she has, to be honest, if there was anything that bad for her to delete. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I don't know. I doubt it's anywhere near as bad as what we're seeing in central government right now. She said the Scottish Government received a request in September from the UK COVID inquiry to hand over WhatsApp messages from officials. This is someone called Miss Robinson, I think, confirmed the Scottish Government had been issued a formal legal order under Section 21 of the Inquiries Act 2005 to release the material, which he said was necessary due to privacy concerns. The Deputy First Minister said, quote, all requested messages held will be shared in full and unredacted by the 6th of November, end quote. And, we are heading into the 6th of November, this video being recorded before then, so it should be interesting to see what's there and if there is anything, any deleted messages, amongst other things. So we'll see what happens. I mean, they're going to have to hand them over because it's a legal request. I do wonder about the stuff Rishi Sunak said he couldn't get, and Boris Johnson said he couldn't get. What's going to happen regarding those messages? Is there going to be kind of some sort of legal request for them to do some sort of sanction if they don't? Or maybe the government are forced to hand them over. I don't know. But we'll see what happens. Hamza Yusuf saying he hasn't deleted any messages. We'll see if that is the case. But again, I think the Scottish Government dealt with COVID way better than the Westminster Government did. I think the Welsh Government struggled the most, but that could be down to a combination of factors. Let's not forget that it was Westminster that held the purse strings for a lot of the decisions. They were trying to kind of nickel and dime people in Manchester because Manchester's the COVID in Manchester was quite bad before the second lockdown, and when Andy Burnham asked for furlough support, they weren't going to offer him the 80% they offered the rest of the country before that. They were going to offer him something like 65% or 64%, and it caused a massive problem. I think Andy Burnham really did try to fight hard for Manchester, and in the end there was a national lockdown and the 80% furlough was given, which again it kind of shows you how kind of the nickel and dime approach the Westminster government did. But I think from what I remember, the SNP dealt with COVID quite well, a lot better than Westminster, a lot better than England did anyways. But I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you want, or if you can. And yeah, I do wonder what more we'll see from this inquiry. This being recorded on the 2nd of November. I do wonder how many other people are there to give evidence and how big it will be. Because I think bringing in Dominic Cummings and that civil servant Helen McNamara, I don't know if there's anyone that's going to be that much bigger than them, apart from, of course, Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. But I'll catch you in the next one.